Absolutely. Here's section 1, cold open slash hook as a full script, aiming for a length of 1,000–2,000 letters with a strong, engaging opening and a natural flow. July 15, 1815. The fields of Waterloo are thick with smoke and chaos as Napoleon's army faces off against the combined might of Britain and Prussia. The fate of Europe hangs in the balance, but the real battle for power is unfolding hundreds of miles away, in the heart of London's financial district. There Nathan Mayer Rothschild sits quietly at the London Stock Exchange, surrounded by anxious traders. What sets Rothschild apart isn't just his wealth, it's his access to information. While the rest of London waits for official news from the battlefield, Rothschild's private network of couriers, riders, and carrier pigeons is already in motion, racing across Europe to deliver the outcome of the war straight to his desk. By the afternoon of July 19th, Rothschild knows what no one else does. Wellington has triumphed and Napoleon is finished. But instead of celebrating, Rothschild makes a move that stuns the market. He begins selling off British government bonds fast and hard. The traders around him panic. If Rothschild is selling, they reason disaster must be coming. The price of British bonds plummets as fear spreads like wildfire. But just as the market hits rock bottom, Rothschild's agents quietly start buying everything in sight. The next day, the official news arrives: Britain has won. The value of the bonds soars and Rothschild walks away with a fortune that would be worth billions today. This wasn't luck and it wasn't illegal. It was a masterclass in information and timing, a demonstration of how, in the new world of finance, power belonged not to those with the biggest armies but to those who controlled the flow of information and capital. This single move didn't just make Rothschild rich, it revealed a new reality that would shape the next 2 centuries. Whoever controls the money controls the future. And the story of how a handful of banking dynasties built a system that now governs trillions of dollars and the fate of nations begins right here, in the chaos after Waterloo. But the Rothschilds were just getting started. The real story of financial power was only beginning to unfold. Absolutely. Here's asterisk section 2, the birth of banking dynasties as a full script aiming for 1,000–2,000 letters. The rise of the banking dynasties didn't start with palaces or political titles. It began in the cramped, bustling streets of Frankfurt, Germany, where Mayer Amschel Rothschild ran a modest coin shop in the 1760s. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about his business, but Mayer understood something most others didn't. Money wasn't just a tool for trade, it was a weapon, and whoever mastered its movement could shape the destiny of nations. He taught this lesson to his 5 sons, each of whom would become a pillar in the family's growing empire. Instead of keeping his family close, Mayer sent each son to a different European capital: Nathan to London, James to Paris, Salomon to Vienna, Karl to Naples, and Amschel stayed in Frankfurt. This wasn't just a family reunion spread across the continent, it was the creation of the first true international banking network. While other banks were limited by borders and local politics, the Rothschilds could move money, gold, and information across Europe with unprecedented speed and secrecy. Their private courier system, faster than any government post, allowed them to outmaneuver rivals and even entire nations. But the real genius of the Rothschild model was their approach to risk. While kings and emperors gambled everything on the outcome of wars, the Rothschilds played both sides. They would lend to Britain in London and to France in Paris, ensuring that no matter who won or lost on the battlefield, the family would always be repaid with interest. This strategy wasn't just profitable, it was revolutionary. It meant that the Rothschilds could remain above the fray, untouched by the shifting tides of politics and war, while governments became increasingly dependent on their capital. This business model, financing all sides, taking no political position, and ensuring that every government owed them, became the foundation of dynastic banking power. It was brutally simple and incredibly effective. As the 19th century dawned, European monarchs found themselves in constant need of funds for wars, palaces, and grand projects. But traditional banks were limited by geography and national loyalties. The Rothschilds, with their cross-border network and willingness to lend to anyone, became the go-to financiers for the continent's most powerful rulers. By the time Nathan Rothschild orchestrated his legendary move at Waterloo, the family had already established itself as the most powerful financial force in Europe. They didn't need armies or thrones. Their influence came from the invisible threads of debt and information woven quietly through the heart of every major capital. And as their power grew, other families began to take notice, setting the stage for a new era, one where the fate of nations would be decided not on the battlefield but in the counting rooms of Europe's banking dynasties. But controlling government debt was only the first step. The real power would come from controlling the very systems that created money itself. Absolutely. Here's section 3, stage 1, controlling government debt in Europe as a full script, aiming for 1,000–2,000 letters. After Waterloo, Europe was a continent in ruins. Decades of war had left even the mightiest empires, Britain, France, Austria, Prussia, Russia, drowning in debt. The cost of armies, weapons, and endless campaigns had bankrupted governments and left treasuries empty. But where kings saw crisis, the Rothschilds saw opportunity. They understood a simple but devastating truth: if you control a nation's debt, you control its destiny. Nathan Rothschild, now the dominant force in London, became the British government's go-to financier. When Britain needed to borrow, it was Rothschild who underwrote the bonds, set the terms, and decided which investors would get access. This wasn't just about collecting interest. It was about leverage. If the British government wanted to pursue a policy Nathan didn't like, he could simply refuse to finance it. In effect, he held veto power over the world's most powerful empire, without ever holding a government office or wearing a crown. The same pattern repeated across Europe. In Paris, James de Rothschild became the chief financier of the restored French monarchy. In Vienna, Salomon von Rothschild bankrolled the Austrian Empire. Karl von Rothschild did the same for the Kingdom of Naples. By 1830, the Rothschild family held an estimated 50% of all government bonds in Europe. Imagine that for a moment, half of the continent's sovereign debt owed to a single family. It was a level of influence that no king or emperor could match. But the Rothschilds weren't just collecting interest, they were shaping the very structure of European finance. At the time, most countries operated on the gold standard. Currency was backed by gold, and governments couldn't simply print more money whenever they wanted. This limited their ability to borrow and spend unless they had a central bank. Britain had the Bank of England, a private institution owned by shareholders, and by the 1820s the Rothschilds were among its major shareholders. Other countries, however, still relied on government treasuries, which meant they were at the mercy of their gold reserves. The Rothschilds saw the potential in central banks. These institutions could issue currency, set interest rates, and lend to governments without the constraints of gold. In Austria, Salomon von Rothschild helped establish the Austrian National Bank. In France, James de Rothschild influenced the creation of the Bank of France. In Italy, Karl von Rothschild worked with the Bank of Naples. These weren't government agencies, they were private banks with monopoly power, and the Rothschilds were either major shareholders or primary creditors. By 1850, the Rothschilds had influence over monetary policy in Britain, France, Austria, Naples, and Prussia. They didn't need to run for office or command armies. They controlled the institutions that controlled the money. And with every loan, every bond, every central bank they helped create, their grip on Europe tightened. This was the first stage of dynastic banking power. Control government debt and you control the government. But the Rothschilds weren't content to rule just Europe. Across the Atlantic, a new nation was rising, a nation with untapped potential and no entrenched financial system. The next move would take the Dynasties' power global. Absolutely. Here's Section 4, Stage 2, Expansion to America * as a full script, aiming for 1,000–2,000 letters. While the Rothschilds tightened their grip on Europe, a new world was taking shape across the Atlantic. The United States, young and restless, was bursting with ambition but starved for capital. Unlike the old monarchies, America had no royal treasuries or ancient banking houses. Its financial system was fragile, its banks small and scattered, and its government deeply suspicious of concentrated power. Twice the country had experimented with a central bank, the first and second banks of the United States, but both were killed off by fierce political opposition. President Andrew Jackson, famously distrustful of bankers, called them a den of vipers and thieves and vowed to drive them out. By 1836, America was left without a central bank, and for the next 77 years the nation's finances would be a wild frontier. But progress doesn't wait for politics. As the country expanded westward, building railroads, factories, and cities, it needed money more than any local bank could provide. So American financiers turned to Europe, and Europe answered. British and continental capital, much of it managed or influenced by the Rothschilds, began to flow into the United States. The Rothschilds didn't just send money, they sent people. In 1837, August Belmont arrived in New York as the family's official agent. He quickly established August Belmont and Company, which would become one of the most powerful banking houses in America. Belmont financed railroads, government bonds, and industrial expansion, but always with an eye toward integrating American finance into the broader European system. The Rothschilds' approach in America mirrored their strategy in Europe: stay above politics, finance both sides, and ensure that whoever emerged victorious would owe them. During the Civil War, both the Union and the Confederacy desperately needed funds. European banks, including those affiliated with the Rothschilds, played both sides. The North issued bonds in London, while the South tried to do the same, though with less success. No matter who won, the bankers would be repaid. After the war, America's industrial engine roared to life. Railroads crisscrossed the continent, steel mills belched smoke, and oil gushed from the ground. This explosive growth required even more capital, and once again European money, often funneled through Rothschild agents and their American partners, was there to supply it. But as the 19th century drew to close, a new force was rising in American finance, one that would eventually rival even the great European dynasties. Enter J.P. Morgan. Born into a wealthy banking family, Morgan learned the ropes in London, absorbing the secrets of European finance. In 1871, he partnered with the Drexel family to form Drexel, Morgan & Co. in New York, which would later become the legendary J.P. Morgan & Co. Morgan's genius wasn't just in lending money, it was in consolidating power. He merged competing companies into monopolies, created the first billion-dollar corporation with U.S. Steel, and restructured entire industries. By 1900, J.P. Morgan controlled more capital than any other American banker. Yet he was never truly independent. His connections to European banking through his father's London bank and partnerships with Rothschild-affiliated institutions made him the bridge between the old world and the new. This transatlantic alliance reached its climax during the Panic of 1907. When a banking crisis threatened to bring down the entire U.S. financial system, it wasn't the government that stepped in, it was J.P. Morgan. He locked the nation's top bankers in his library and forced them to pool their resources to save the system. The crisis was averted, but the lesson was clear. America needed a central bank, and it needed to be run by bankers, not politicians. The stage was set for the next great leap in financial power. The dynasties had conquered Europe and integrated America. Now they would create the institution that would control the world's most powerful economy from the inside out. The era of the Federal Reserve was about to begin absolutely. Here's Section 5, Stage 3, creating the Federal Reserve as a full script, aiming for 1,000–2,000 letters. By the dawn of the 20th century, America was a financial powerhouse, but its banking system was dangerously unstable. Panics and bank runs were common, and the government had no real tools to stop them. The Panic of 1907 was the final warning shot, a near collapse that was only averted because J.P. Morgan himself stepped in, using his personal influence to force New York's top bankers to rescue the system. But everyone knew this was a temporary fix. The country needed a central bank, but the very idea was toxic to the American public. Memories of Andrew Jackson's war against the Second Bank of the United States still lingered. And populist politicians railed against the idea of giving Wall Street even more power. So, the next stage of financial control had to be crafted in secrecy. In November 1910, 7 of the most powerful men in American finance boarded a private train under false names, bound for a secluded resort on Jekyll Island, Georgia. The group included Senator Nelson Aldrich, whose family would later merge with the Rockefellers, Frank Vanderlip of National City Bank, Paul Warburg, a partner at Kuhn, Loeb & Co. with deep ties to the Rothschilds, Henry P. Davison of J.P. Morgan & Co., Benjamin Strong, who would become the first governor of the New York Fed, Charles D. Norton of First National Bank, and A. Piatt Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. For 9 days, they worked in total secrecy, drafting the blueprint for what would become the Federal Reserve Act. They knew the public would never accept a central bank controlled by Wall Street, so they disguised it. They called it the Federal Reserve System, making it sound like a government agency, and divided it into regional banks to give the illusion of decentralization. But the real power was concentrated in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which was dominated by the same Wall Street interests that had orchestrated the meeting. The structure was ingenious. The Federal Reserve would be a private corporation, owned by its member banks. The government would appoint a few officials, but operational control would remain firmly in the hands of the bankers. The Federal Reserve Act was introduced to Congress in 1913. A 1,000-page bill that most lawmakers barely understood. It passed the House and Senate just before Christmas, when many members had already left Washington. President Woodrow Wilson signed it into law on December 23, 1913. Within months, the Federal Reserve was up and running, with Benjamin Strong at the helm of the New York Fed and Paul Warburg on the Federal Reserve Board. The connections to European banking dynasties remained intact. Warburg's brother ran a major bank in Germany, and J.P. Morgan's partnerships with European institutions continued to shape global finance. The creation of the Federal Reserve marked a turning point in American history. For the first time, the power to create money, set interest rates, and rescue banks in crisis was placed in the hands of a private institution, insulated from direct government control. The Fed could create money out of thin air by buying government bonds, and it could lend to the government at interest, ensuring a steady stream of profits for its member banks. When World War I erupted just months later, the Federal Reserve created over $25 billion in new money to finance America's entry into the conflict, money that was lent to the government at interest, and money that would ultimately be repaid by generations of taxpayers. But the real consolidation of power was just beginning. The Federal Reserve was only the first piece of a much larger puzzle. As the world descended into 2 devastating wars, the banking dynasties would use their influence to create a network of global institutions that would shape the fate of nations for the next century. The age of national banking power was ending. The era of global financial control was about to begin, absolutely. Here's asterisk Section 6, Stage 4, World Wars and Global Institutions as a full script, aiming for 1,000–2,000 letters. The outbreak of World War I marked a seismic shift in global finance. For the first time, the world's most powerful nations were locked in a conflict so vast that it would reshape economies, borders, and the very structure of money itself. Behind the scenes, the banking dynasties, now anchored by the likes of J.P. Morgan, the Rothschilds, the Warburgs, and the Rockefellers, were not just financing the war, they were quietly consolidating their grip on the world's financial arteries. During the war, J.P. Morgan & Co. became the official purchasing and financial agent for the British and French governments in the United States. The firm underwrote more than $3 billion in Allied war bonds, a sum that would be worth over $70 billion today. The Rothschilds, with their sprawling network, financed various governments on both sides of the conflict. The Warburgs, split between Germany and America, maintained banking relationships that transcended national borders. The business model was as ruthless as it was effective: lend to all sides, profit from every outcome, and ensure that whoever emerged from the rubble would be indebted to the banks. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, Europe was shattered. Britain and France owed enormous sums to American banks. Germany was crushed by reparations. The old European banking houses had survived, but the real power now rested in New York. J.P. Morgan and Co. orchestrated the loans that allowed Europe to rebuild, holding more government debt than any institution in history. By the 1920s, American banks, especially those controlled by the Morgans, Rockefellers, and their allies, dominated global finance. But the world was far from stable. The stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed wiped out thousands of smaller banks, but the dynasties endured. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 forced J.P. Morgan and Co. to split into separate commercial and investment banks, but the same families maintained control behind the scenes. Then came World War II, and with it, another opportunity for the banking dynasties to expand their influence. American banks, led by the Morgans and Rockefellers, financed the Allied war effort, underwriting more than $260 billion in government bonds. The Federal Reserve created the money, the banks collected the fees, and by 1945 the United States held two-thirds of the world's gold reserves. The British Empire was bankrupt and European banks were in ruins. This was the moment when global financial power shifted decisively from Europe to America. But the dynasties didn't just want to control national economies, they wanted to shape the entire world order. In July 1944, as World War II neared its end, representatives from 44 nations gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design the post-war financial system. The result was the creation of two new institutions, the International Monetary Fund (IMF) and the World Bank. The IMF would manage international currency stability while the World Bank would finance reconstruction and development. Both were headquartered in Washington, D.C., and both were controlled by their largest shareholders, primarily the United States and by extension the banks that dominated American finance. But there was a third institution, even more secretive, the Bank for International Settlements (BIS), founded in 1930 in Basel, Switzerland. Officially, the BIS was created to handle German war reparations after World War I. In reality, it became the central bank for central banks, a private club where the world's most powerful bankers could coordinate policy, immune from any government oversight. The BIS is owned by its member central banks, operates with legal immunity, and holds secret meetings that set the course for global monetary policy. Even during World War II, the BIS continued to operate, facilitating transactions between Allied and Axis nations alike. By 1945, the banking dynasties had achieved what no empire ever could. They had created a network of global institutions, the Federal Reserve, the BIS, the IMF, and the World Bank, that could shape the destiny of nations from behind closed doors. The dollar became the world's reserve currency, backed by gold and trusted by governments everywhere. The system was designed to be complex, opaque, and insulated from public scrutiny. The real power was no longer in the hands of kings or presidents, but in the boardrooms of banks and the institutions they controlled. Yet even this system had its limits. The gold standard, which anchored the world's currencies, was a chain that kept money creation in check. But in the decades to come, that final restraint would be shattered, unleashing a new era of financial power, one where money itself would be backed by nothing but trust, and the scale of wealth creation would reach heights the original dynasties could scarcely imagine. Absolutely. Here's Section 7, Stage 5, the Fiat Era and Modern System as a full script, aiming for 1,000–2,000 letters. By the late 1960s, the financial world was on the edge of a transformation that would make everything that came before look almost quaint. The post-war system, built on the promise that every US dollar could be exchanged for gold at $35 an ounce, was starting to crack. The United States had been printing dollars to pay for the Vietnam War and ambitious social programs, flooding the world with more paper money than there was gold to back it. Foreign governments, especially France under Charles de Gaulle, began demanding gold in exchange for their growing piles of dollars. The US gold reserves started to dwindle, and the world's trust in the system began to falter. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon made a decision that would change the course of financial history. In a televised address, he announced that the United States would no longer exchange dollars for gold. The so-called gold window was slammed shut. Overnight, the dollar and by extension every major currency on Earth became a pure fiat currency, backed by nothing but government promises and the faith of the public. The last link to gold was gone, and with it, the final restraint on how much money could be created. This unleashed a new era of financial power. Central banks led by the Federal Reserve now had the ability to create unlimited amounts of money with a few keystrokes. No longer constrained by gold reserves, they could respond to crises, stimulate economies, and bail out banks on a scale that would have been unthinkable just a generation earlier. The only real limit was inflation, and even that could be managed or at least postponed through interest rates and careful messaging to the public. The results were staggering. From 1971 to the present, the Federal Reserve has created over $20 trillion, fueling an explosion in asset prices, stocks, bonds, real estate, and more. The people who benefited most were those who already owned assets, the wealthiest families, the largest corporations, and of course, the banks and institutions that had built the system in the first place. When crises hit, like the financial meltdown of 2008 or the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, the response was always the same: print more money, bail out the banks, and let the new cash flow into the financial markets. In 2008, the Fed created $4.5 trillion in quantitative easing. In 2020, it was another $5 trillion. Each time the wealth gap widened, and the concentration of power at the top grew even more extreme. The banking dynasties themselves evolved. The Rockefellers shifted much of their wealth into philanthropy and investment management. The Morgans merged with Chase Manhattan and Chemical Bank, eventually forming J.P. Morgan Chase, the largest bank in America with nearly $4 trillion in assets. The Rothschilds remained active in global finance, running a powerful advisory and wealth management firm. The Warburgs merged with other banks but continued to influence finance through investment vehicles and foundations. Yet, the real power was no longer in the hands of individual families. It was embedded in the institutions they had created: the Federal Reserve, the Bank for International Settlements, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. These institutions now operate on a scale that would have been unimaginable to the original dynasties. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet has ballooned to over $7 trillion. Global central banks control more than $30 trillion in assets. The total global debt has soared past $37 trillion, and the derivatives market, those complex financial bets that few truly understand, has a notional value of over $600 trillion. The system is so vast, so interconnected, and so insulated from public oversight that it operates almost as a world unto itself. And at the heart of it all are the same megabanks: J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, descendants of the old dynasties, still pulling the levers of global finance. Their executives rotate between Wall Street and Washington, shaping policy and regulation to suit their interests. The public doesn't vote for the Federal Reserve chairman. No one elects the board of the BIS. The rules are written in boardrooms, not parliaments. This is the modern financial system. A world where money is created from nothing, debt is endless, and the true power lies not with governments or voters but with the institutions that control the flow of capital. The dynasties may have faded into the background, but the system they built is more dominant and more untouchable than ever before. But even this system has its limits. The next crisis is already brewing, and the question is no longer who controls the money, but what happens when the debt becomes too big to ignore absolutely. Here's Section 8. The legacy, institutions over families, as a full script, aiming for 1,000–2,000 letters. Today, the names Rothschild, Morgan, Rockefeller, and Warburg still echo through the halls of finance, but the real legacy of these dynasties isn't just in their family fortunes, it's in the institutions they left behind. Over 2 centuries, these families built a system so vast, so complex, and so deeply embedded in the machinery of global finance that it now operates almost independently of any single person or government. The true power has shifted from individual dynasties to the institutions they created. And these institutions have become the invisible architects of the modern world. Consider the Federal Reserve. It began as a controversial experiment, born in secrecy and designed to stabilize the American economy. Today, it is the single most powerful central bank on the planet, with the ability to create trillions of dollars at will, set interest rates that ripple through every market, and rescue banks or entire industries with a few strokes of a pen. Yet for all its power, the Federal Reserve is not a government agency in the traditional sense. Its board is appointed, not elected. Its meetings are closed to the public. Its decisions are insulated from the pressures of democracy. The same is true for the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a shadowy institution that coordinates policy among the world's central banks, immune from prosecution and operating behind layers of secrecy. Then there's the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, both headquartered in Washington, D.C., both presented as tools for global development and stability. In reality, these institutions wield enormous leverage over the economies of more than 190 countries. When a nation faces a financial crisis, the IMF steps in with loans, but always with strings attached. Austerity measures, structural reforms, and policy changes are demanded in exchange for help, often benefiting Western corporations and financial interests. The World Bank, meanwhile, funds massive infrastructure projects that can reshape entire regions, but the benefits often flow back to the same handful of multinational companies and banks that dominate the system. The megabanks, J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, are the modern descendants of the old dynasties. Their executives move seamlessly between boardrooms and government offices, shaping regulations, influencing policy, and ensuring that the rules of the game always favor those at the top. The so-called revolving door between Wall Street and Washington is not a conspiracy theory, it's a documented reality. Treasury secretaries, Federal Reserve chairs, and top regulators routinely come from the ranks of these banks, and often return to them after their public service. What's most striking is how little democratic oversight exists over this system. The public doesn't vote on Federal Reserve policy. No one elects the leaders of the BIS or the IMF. The decisions that shape the global economy are made in private meetings by unelected officials using models and assumptions that most people will never see. The complexity of the system itself acts as a shield, making it nearly impossible for outsiders to understand, let alone challenge, the true sources of power. Meanwhile, the concentration of wealth has reached levels that would have stunned even the original banking dynasties. The top 1% now controls more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. Asset prices soar, fueled by endless money creation, while wages stagnate and debt piles up. The institutions built by the Rothschilds, Morgans, Rockefellers, and Warburgs have become self-perpetuating machines, extracting value from every corner of the global economy and funneling it upward. Yet for all their power, these institutions are not invincible. The system they built is showing signs of strain. Global debt has reached unprecedented levels. Central banks are running out of tools to manage the next crisis. The public is growing restless, questioning the legitimacy of a system that seems to serve only the few. The legacy of the banking dynasties is not just one of wealth and power. It's a system that now stands at a crossroads, facing challenges that even its creators could never have imagined. But as history has shown, those who understand the system are always one step ahead. And as the world faces its next great financial reckoning, the question is no longer just who built the system, but who will control what comes next. Absolutely. Here's Section 9, Conclusion, the system's limits and what's next asterisk as a full script, aiming for 2,000 letters. The story of the banking dynasties is not just a tale of wealth and power. It's a blueprint for how the modern world was built, and a warning about where it might be headed. For over 2 centuries, a handful of families and the institutions they created have shaped the flow of money, the rise and fall of nations, and the very rules that govern the global economy. But even the most carefully constructed systems have limits, and today those limits are coming into view. The numbers are staggering. Global debt has soared past $37 trillion, a figure so large it's almost impossible to comprehend. Central banks have created more than $20 trillion since the end of the gold standard, and the derivatives market, those complex financial contracts that few truly understand, now has a notional value in the hundreds of trillions. The world's financial system is bigger, faster, and more interconnected than ever before, but it's also more fragile. Every new crisis, whether it's a banking panic, a pandemic, or a geopolitical shock, seems to require even more money creation, even more debt, and even more intervention from the very institutions that were designed to keep things stable. But what happens when the system reaches its mathematical limits? When the debt can no longer be serviced, and the central banks can't print their way out without triggering runaway inflation? This is the question that keeps economists, policymakers, and even the banking elite awake at night. There's a growing sense that the next crisis won't be like the last. The tools that worked in 2008 and 2020, massive bailouts, zero interest rates, endless liquidity, may not be enough to contain the fallout when the next shock hits. Behind closed doors, the world's wealthiest families and institutions are already preparing. Reports suggest that the elite are quietly shifting their wealth into hard assets, gold, real estate, commodities, while the public is left holding paper promises. Central banks themselves are buying gold at record levels, a move that hasn't gone unnoticed by those who remember the lessons of history. The message is clear: when trust in the system begins to crack, those with the most to lose are the first to seek shelter. For everyone else, the stakes couldn't be higher. Inflation quietly erodes savings, wages struggle to keep up with the cost of living, and the dream of financial security feels more distant than ever. The institutions that were supposed to ensure stability now seem to operate beyond the reach of ordinary people, making decisions in secret, insulated from democratic accountability. The system extracts wealth through debt and inflation, rewarding those who own assets and punishing those who don't. Yet understanding this history is more than just an academic exercise, it's a form of survival. The story of the banking dynasties is a reminder that the rules of the game can change, and that those who pay attention are always better positioned to adapt. The next chapter of global finance is unwritten, but the warning signs are everywhere. The debt is unsustainable, the money creation is unprecedented, and the concentration of power is reaching levels that even the original dynasties might have found alarming. So what comes next? Will the system bend, or will it finally break under its own weight? Will new institutions rise from the ashes, or will the old guard find a way to reinvent themselves once again? These are the questions that will define the coming decades. One thing is certain: the era of quiet, unchallenged control is ending. The world is waking up to the reality that whoever controls the creation of money controls the fate of nations, not through violence or conquest, but through the invisible machinery of debt, interest, and monetary policy. If this journey through the hidden history of global finance has opened your eyes, remember knowledge is power. The next crisis may be closer than anyone thinks, and those who understand the system will be the ones best prepared to navigate whatever comes next. Stay curious, stay informed, and never stop asking who really benefits when the money moves. Because in the end, understanding the past is the first step to surviving the future.